William,
Hi.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to
I'm
meet
Emma
you
Widders.
too.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
You all right? Do you have anything you need to put down? You're okay.
No, yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
Good. Okay, so lovely to meet you. I'm Emma Widders. I'm a Director of Studies here in Modern Languages and a Fellow of Russian.
And I'm Carlos Fonseca. I'm a fellow in Spanish and Director of Studies as well. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Just to give you a sense of how things are going to go today, first thing to say is we really want this to just be a conversation, and if there's a question that we ask or anything you don't understand, you should absolutely feel free to ask us to ask it again in different terms. So what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit in general terms first of all, and then you should have had this text.
Yes.
So then we'll spend a little bit of time discussing the text.
Amazing.
And at the end we'll make sure there's a chance for you to ask a question if you want.
Cool.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Good. All right, so the question you must be expecting in some way. I know you've studied a little bit of Russian already. Yeah. What is it about that experience, or perhaps it's something else, that made you think, I want to study Russian ab initio, made you want to take that challenge on?
I think there are a couple of key things about Russia and Russian that I find really interesting. First of all, it was when I was looking at the Cyrillic alphabet, the thing that really threw me was the soft sign. And I think that's a really interesting thing I hadn't come across in any of the other languages I've looked at. I find myself quite comfortable with Latin, and the fact that there's something else like a soft sign that acts so differently I found really interesting and something I'd like to become more proficient with. But also, Russia is just such an important country in the world right now, and it's a society and a culture that from the outside looks so different to anything I know, and something that I really can't quite get my head around, and I feel like learning the language and the culture would be the best way to actually engage with what the country and the state is doing.
Very good. Yeah, you write here that you're interested in how a society's beliefs about its origins affect the way it writes about its history.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting statement, especially in relation to Russia and the power of history in Russia. I wondered if you have any sense of specific Russian historical stories or significant moments that might be affecting the present, if you like.
Well, I think that's the really interesting question, because I think the typical answer has changed very recently. If the end of the Cold War, for example, might have seemed for a while as the new beginning for Russia. But maybe with Putin that feels increasingly untrue. If you think he was in the KGB, there are these quite interesting connections to maybe a continuation of what Russia was before. And even then, how far back can we go? That there's maybe a connection with this idea of wanting to potentially rebuild a Russian empire, something like that. So these ideas of foundation myths and how that affects the writing and the literature. Russia feels quite interesting that there seems to be maybe 3 or 4 different foundation myths you could draw on. And that's something really interesting with Russia that draws me to it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Sometimes I think actually what a nation really needs is to just liberate itself entirely from its history.
William, one of the things that you were mentioning was the tension between myth and history, and I was wondering, they're very similar, but there are also different modalities of relating to the past and to the future. So, any differences that you see there between a mythical approach to events and a historical approach to events?
Yeah, I think the mythical approach is just a specific version of history, right? You're trying to write it in the history of a country or a nation or a people in the most, the best light possible. And whereas histories often are much more critical than that. And I think if you're genuinely trying to write a text that was just trying to reinforce a foundation myth, it doesn't necessarily need to actually be interested in facts at all. It just needs to be interested in building up an identity and a powerful and encouraging, maybe comforting story. And history can be much crueler than that, and the writing can be much more negative.
That's very interesting. And one of the things that we do here is that, we see how those myths and those histories interact with cultural objects, like let's say text or literature. How do you think that literature also helps build a sort of imagined community that otherwise would be just bits and pieces?
Well, I suppose it can just create a universal understanding. If you think that maybe in English we have Shakespeare, things like that, there are these ideas that everyone knows Romeo and Juliet. It's these shorthand metaphors that help connect everyone and actually unite those who speak the language beyond just all speaking the same language. There is a shared culture because there are the same prolific texts that everyone maybe reads at school or something like that.
And is that a problem? Does that build belonging, or could that also build exclusion? I think people don't share the same text or don't feel they share the same text.
That's a really good point. I hadn't actually ever properly thought about that. I guess it depends on how far you take it. So if you have... Britain has no problem with Romeo and Juliet, for example, because you don't have to have read it, and even if you haven't read it, you can still come across those ideas. But maybe in a slightly more authoritarian state, where there's more control over what literature there is, and a stricter encouragement of studying specific texts, maybe that then homogenizes and more deliberately excludes people. Although, actually, people probably would be quite surprised if you didn't know Romeo and Juliet. So maybe that's not entirely true. Maybe that is a universal problem.
Very good. There's lots of things we could talk about there, but time is always an issue in these interviews, so we probably should spend a little while on this text. And I think probably the best thing to do to start with is just to ask you what you made of it, really. What are the things that struck you about it?
That's a question. It really does change my opinion of when I've read the first line compared to when you finish it. It's very different. But I think the thing I came away from it thinking the most is that this must clearly be a critique of Stalinism and the USSR and doublethink, essentially. It feels like the not knowing whether or not a 7 or an 8 comes first is actually about arguing that Soviet ideology or maybe communism makes no sense, that it is obvious, and the arguments that occur later on in the poem are either obviously that there are the arguments between those who are right, that 7 comes after 6, and those who are wrong, that 8 comes after 6. And it feels like it's trying to be a somewhat hidden indictment of that. Although I was wondering when I was reading it whether or not 7 or 8 was actually a more specific metaphor, whether or not there were maybe, because I know Stalin had a 5-year plan, I wonder whether or not maybe there were 14 points for human action or something like that, where actually 7 and 8 were specific and that people couldn't remember which one came next.
If there were and we hadn't told you, that would be cruel on our part, wouldn't it? But you ask, it's a very good question to ask, because you're right, I think, that the numbers and that sort of notion of endless targets and focus and logic that's often absurd, was very much part of Stalinist rhetoric. So let's just go back to that question of making sense for a minute, because you're absolutely right, I think, that this is a text which is all about nonsense, if you like. We put in the notes above, this is a time when literature is being asked to do certain things, and asked you to think about narrative and also about poetic form. Why do you think it is called a sonnet? Well, why do you think it's got all this linearity? Any thoughts really about form and sense making?
I did find that really interesting. I was going to ask, sonnets in English normally rhyme. Did this rhyme in the original Russian? Would a Russian sonnet be expected to rhyme? A typical Russian sonnet?
Not necessarily. Okay. Not necessarily, but you're on the right tracks, I think, very much in thinking about patterns and order and expectation.
Because it feels like maybe if this was a critique of Soviet nonsense, having a story that doesn't quite make sense, that doesn't resolve satisfactorily, they don't have an answer to the question at the end, they just all go home and give up. That's not necessarily a satisfying conclusion. So maybe it feels like the actual way this is constructed is designed to mirror that nonsensicality. Especially because sonnets, I don't know whether this is true again in Russian, but a sonnet's supposed to be about love in Russian, because that I think is quite an interesting idea. If actually this is an implicit critique of the regime, but choosing perhaps the most ironic mode through which to convey that kind of complements that.
Right, so it becomes a question of what literature is supposed to do, doesn't it? And also about the ways in which literary form maybe appears to put an order on the world that maybe that world doesn't have? I mean, is there an extent to which we don't think about the way that stories are constructed with beginnings, middles and ends? We just assume that's how stories work. We don't think about the implicit order that imposes on chaos.
And then when you're given something which doesn't quite make sense and challenges those structures, it helps build out those weird ideas within actual writing itself.
Do you want to?
No, I want to definitely jump on that because it's very interesting and it relates to one passage that like struck me as particularly kind of like illuminating, which is when he says, because her words were void of any meaning, right?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking how like logic tends to be one of the ways in which we impose order on the world, but also language, right?
Yeah.
If you have like a little kid, you realize that they're trying to make sense, but afterwards you forget and you just speak. What happens then when like language kind of begins to enter into crisis?
Yeah. I don't really know very much about what happens when a language is collapsing. I don't really know very much about that at all. But I do, on that point about the language, the words are void of any meaning. It is interesting that in this poem, even in a phrase like she took a small hammer out of her mouth and moving her nose slightly back and forth, those bits that actually don't make any sense because of the wider context of the rest of the poem. Even though it's entirely illogical, it does actually have some hidden meaning and structure inside of it.
That's very interesting. I guess when I was talking about like language collapsing, it's also related to the role of literature, right? Like in common day, like the way of speaking, we just talk normally and like we make sense and everything. But like writers and people like this author like use language differently, right? So they have a different way of approaching what we could call common sense.
Yeah, and I suppose that's maybe part of the joys of a wider literature, where those where people can explore with how far you can take storytelling, how far you can take the use of language, rather than maybe where you're trying to write quote unquote clear texts in support of a specific ideology.
Exactly, absolutely, that's right. So that notion of when language is being asked to do this thing, to be logical and serve something. Then this text is sort of pushing at the boundaries of that, isn't it, and saying what else can it do?
Yeah, so even its implicit, or even just its overt nonsensicality about anything is a direct critique to the regime.
Right, I think so. The last question in relation to that might be about violence, though.
Yeah.
It's all very well for us to say it's all about nonsense, but what about that idea of, well, suddenly, there we were discussing whether 7 comes after 8 or 9.
Yeah.
But then a child fell off, broke both its jaws. That distracted us from our argument. What do you think about that insertion of violence at the end of the text?
Well, I think one of the interesting things about the violence is the fact that it follows a phrase which is just when by some sheer luck, right? It's the banality of violence in this context, that violence is normal and is accepted. And it's interesting that the child broke both of his jaws, right? We only have one. So it's this idea that it's excessive violence, it's impossible violence. That, I think, is quite interesting. And I feel like going back to that, the juxtaposition of banality and then incredibly weirdness, you kind of get that throughout the poem. And the fact that, and I think it builds, right? You go from, an amazing thing happened to me today, I've forgot what comes first, right? That's the first line, and that's quite an interesting kind of subtle dip. It's a juxtaposition, but it's nowhere near as severe as the one at the end. And you've got in the middle, the cashier gave us a sad smile and then took a hammer out of her mouth. Again, there feels like this juxtaposition is a theme throughout the poem. And it builds, maybe like the state has built and strengthened over time.
So I was wondering whether actually we'd say it's not nonsense at all, it's a picture of a society in which in what way might we say actually Soviet era, Stalin era absurdism or nonsense writing is not an escape from reality, but is actually about reality.
Yeah, I suppose it's trying to reflect the absurdity of the system they're in, and in so doing, or even trying to resist the state they're in, like we were talking about earlier. And I think that's quite an interesting build-up of those ideas throughout it.
And what about that notion of distraction? It distracted us. How might distraction be part of that picture?
That's a good question.
Or does distraction as a diagnosis, maybe, to help you think into that?
I suppose it's when they all go home afterwards. Is that a tolerance of the violence? It's a acceptance of the problems and of the violence, and not wanting to respond to it, or not wanting to necessarily have to engage with it. I'm not certain about that. I'm not entirely sure. But if you think that maybe normally violence wouldn't be a distraction, if you saw a child fall off, you'd probably run and help.
Right.
And so maybe that again reflects the absurdity of the ideologies, and that is a distraction and a saviour for the system. Maybe that's it. Maybe the violence and the overbearing violence that you're trying to resist and save yourself from ultimately stops you and distracts you from being able to engage with the double think of the various different policies. Maybe that's what the sonnet's trying to convey. But I'm not
just
certain
the
about that.
radical dehumanising, of a society in which nothing makes sense and yet everything is given huge sense. Everything is given huge importance.
Yeah.
Did you want to follow up on anything in the text or move on?
No, I think it's fine.
Excellent, William. So, is there anything that you wanted to talk to us about? I don't mean a question, but I don't want you to get to the end of the interview and think, I wish I'd had a chance to talk about such and such from your personal statement, or...
I suppose I'd be interested in key Russian or Soviet texts or pieces of literature that help build on those ideas of a national myth. Because I've had those ideas, I've seen those other places, but I haven't really ever properly engaged with that in relation to Russia. And it'd be quite interesting to know whether or not there are those key pieces of literature within Russia that maybe point out different national myths.
Oh, there absolutely are, yes, there absolutely are. There's a real emphasis in particular on the 19th century canon as the great novels as setting up Russia's place in society. And that leads me to a question for you really, which is, I mean, you're obviously very interested in politics.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if and how you think that your contemporary sense of British politics can find an expression in any sort of fiction. So is there any way in which you think today, so we're saying, yes, absolutely, the Russian national idea has been shaped by cultural texts. Do you think that for young people today, it is in any way the case that the cultural texts that surround you inflect the way you think about politics?
I feel like that absolutely is the case. When you do English language GCSE, virtually every poem you do is English. They're all written by English authors. I think you do one or two American authors, but a lot of it is centred on, we do Dickens, we do Shakespeare, and they are built into a mythological British canon, or actually English canon. We don't do Scottish authors really. And I think that's quite an interesting thing. You think about King Arthur, for example, these ideas that are built into an England that has stood on its own for 1,000 years, for 1,000 years, and stood up to everyone else everywhere. And I think we see that even recently with films like Finest Hour, where we glorify and mythologize Churchill maybe, and that kind of similar to maybe every state, but maybe also even just the USSR, right? That we use culture and texts to homogenize and enforce uniformity, partly through education, but also just through what is good.
And do you think that only relates to how we view the past, or does it also have to do with how we imagine futures, for example? That's
a really good question. I suppose it affects how people currently think about what the country is today, and that leads to the future. So maybe I think you can connect Brexit to ideas of English exceptionalism and wanting to move forward and able to move forward as a independent country that is powerful. And maybe that connects into that idea of the future is about ideas of English past. So maybe separating so clearly the past and the future is not the best way of looking at it when we can connect them all to the same idea of what England or Britain is.
So just one last question, because we've probably got 1 minute left then. On that basis, why study languages and the culture of other places?
I suppose I know that I can't understand, you couldn't understand those ideas about what it means to be British and English unless you've read those texts that are revered and upheld by the culture. So that's why I really want to do Russian. It's that how are you supposed to know why Putin wants Ukraine or is anti-democracy and things without looking at, to at least a degree, the culture he's read, the books he's read, and also how that affects what other people might think. And I think that's why it's so interesting to me, is that without the language, without the culture, without what people have read, believe, and used to read and believe, you can't understand what anyone today could think or what Russia is.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think we're done unless there's anything pressing for you that you'd like to ask.
Oh, just sorry, one random thing about this. There's no author on the poem. Was it published anonymously, or have you just removed the author?
We just removed the author.
Okay.
So he's called Daniel Harms.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he wrote lots of these absurdist, tiny fragments that he called them through the 30s.
Amazing, thank you. That's interesting. I
Lovely.
shall go and read some more.
Well, thank you very much then.
Thank you.
So Williams was an interview for Ab Initio Russian. For an Ab Initio interview in any language, so someone wanting to start a language here from scratch, we're absolutely not looking for expertise in that language or in its culture or in its history. But what was great about the way that William presented himself at the beginning of the interview, when we asked the question, why on earth would you want to study Russian, was that it felt real. It felt authentic. It felt like there had been a moment when he'd spotted something in Russia or Russian that had made him feel committed. So that's probably the most important thing. It doesn't have to be a sophisticated answer, but it needs to feel real and perhaps even individual. And then in the interview, we're obviously not pulling on knowledge that a candidate has about their Ab Initio language or culture, but we're trying to draw out the kinds of interests that they might have. So we have a text in front of William that is a text from Soviet culture, from 1930s period of Stalinism. But again, we're not testing whether he knows anything about that period. We're using the text to engage him in a discussion of the kinds of things that we talk about here when we're teaching.
One of the important things to keep in mind is that we are not looking for clear-cut answers. Rather, we are trying to mimic what happens in supervisions, the type of thought process that is not just us and you guys, but rather something that is happening in conjunction. And William was excellent in that regard. He was, having a conversation, sort of like the conversations that we have in supervisions, and he was thinking alongside us. He was trying to force himself to question himself, to backtrack and then move forward. And I think it is that sort of naturalness what we're looking for in an interview.
The other thing that's worth saying, I think, about this interview is that there are lots of other forms those conversations could have taken. So, for example, at the end I asked William if there's a way in which the culture that surrounds him affects his politics, and he answered about, which is a great answer, about what he'd been taught in school and what British children are taught in school. But that's a question that could just as easily have been answered about TikTok, to be honest, or about hip-hop music, or indeed about any other kind of cultural form that he's encountered. These are questions that are not about testing whether someone knows the stuff that they imagine that Cambridge wants them to know. They're questions that are designed to bring out the way a person thinks on their feet. And that conversation really can be about anything at all.